You can see that okay? So I can't hear you, unfortunately. So I don't know where to. It's not my. I can hear other things on my computer. Is there a setting somewhere on in this complicated device that would give me? Something.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about it. There was something in my settings that couldn't understand my headset.
Okay, good. Okay, so this wasn't my fault.
Sorry about it. And thank you, Professor, for coming early to set up our environment.
Sure, no, it's good to make sure that it actually works, right? Because as you can see, these things never go so smoothly as you might hope.
Yes. That's the problem.
And thanks for the invitation. Nice to speak to you.
Thanks for accepting it. It is really an honor to have you with us, and I think we're going to have a wonderful session.
Will people interrupt during my talk, or will they just, if I encourage them to, or will they mostly ask questions at the end?
It's your style of presentation. If you want them to interrupt you, I can ask them to raise their hand and give them microphone access if you want to, or
yeah, I think it'd be better to have if people. I would also say that as well. So if they have questions, then we can certainly talk about them during the talk. Because we have a nice long. You have like an hour and a half session, right? So it's a plenty of time, and then they can of course also ask questions at the end as well. If they...
Sure. I make sure to manage the session with you and give them microphone access and read the questions for you.
And what is the background of most of the audience?
Most of them are in the Sharif University of Technology. They study most of them computer engineering, electrical engineering, or something related. But we opened the transform into our social media, and there are other people outside of the Sharif community that also participated in the talk. But most of them, the core audience of for us is the people that are taking the deep reinforcement learning course, and it is the most advanced course in our department, and most of them have at least are in the masters, studying their master's degree or their advanced undergrads that we chosen them to took this course.
Right. Yes. Excellent. Yes. Yes, I think this will be a bit more cognitive probably than you're used to, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think people are coming one by one. In 3 minutes, we can start. I think we can start on time, and students will join us one by one. About 50 students signed up for the talk, and I sent them the email. So, okay, I welcome you again, and the stage is yours, dear professor.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to talk to you. So I'm going to
Thank you.
talk today about some work on theory of mind. This has been done with a number of people over actually quite some years. So Andreas Hüller is now at IST in Austria. Reed Montague, a long-term collaborator of mine who's at Virginia Tech, Nitai Alon, and who's a student in the Hebrew University and at Tübingen, Joe Bonby, who's now in Perth, Leon Schultz is a student of mine who's now works for a company, and Jeff Rosenstein, who's at the Computer Science in the Hebrew University. So the plan for the talk is, oh, by the way, I should say, please do interrupt me if you have questions along the way, and we can also, of course, talk at the end of the session too. So I want to say a word or two about theory of mind, how we think of it from the perspective of multi-agent, in some sense, multi-agent reinforcement learning. But this is small numbers of agents, as you'll see. So we're usually looking at one or two. So it's really in the realm of microeconomics. I'll describe to you the P-beauty game, which is a very famous game from economics, which tells us something about the way, gives us some information about the way that people think recursively in theory of mind. Then give you a very simple example, which is designed to try and elucidate the various complexities that come when we think about theory of mind in a recursive context. And then give you a bit more detail about how this works in a ultimatum game, which is again another very famous sort of game theoretic interaction that people have used to look at how humans are willing to share and cooperate. So here we'll talk a bit about dynamic updating, a bit about defection, so the way that agents are trying to fool, in a Machiavellian way, fool each other in the context of this game. Okay, so one very convenient way to start off thinking about theory of mind is it is a form of inverse reinforcement learning. So if I'm interacting with you, I'm thinking about what your goals, beliefs, and desires are, essentially. So in a way, the way that I think that I make decisions myself combines together what I know, what I want, and together that then leads to what I do, right? So if I know about some model of the world, I have a utility function which describes what it is that I want, so how valuable different aspects are, just as you would have in a regular reinforcement learning. That then leads you to think about what the actions would be. So the forwards direction of this arrow goes from what I know and what I want to what I do. And then the inverse reinforcement learning aspect of this says, if I see what you do, I see some actions that you do, I can use that to infer backwards what it is, some aspects of your characteristics. And so here we have a very classic aspect of Bayes' rule for this. So the probability of rewards given actions and costs, that would be the forward model, is the probability of actions given costs and rewards times probability of reward. So here we can work out what your reward structure is, for instance, as a function of what it is that you do. So if I can observe your actions, I can figure out something about you. And if I need you to act in a particular way, or I want you to act in a particular way to satisfy my own goals, then by observing you, I can try and figure out what's in your mind. That's why we call it theory of mind. And a classic example that comes from this work from Yara Ettinger et al. Is shown by this. So imagine here you have two fruits, an apple and an orange, and on a ladder. And you have an agent who might like apples or oranges more or less. Then if you see the agent climbs all the way up to the top of the ladder to collect the orange, then all else being equal, you could infer that the agent has a high utility for the orange. And therefore, if I'm, for instance, an orange seller, I could then set the price for oranges nice and high, because I think this agent will, is willing to do a lot of, in this case, physical effort, but maybe is also willing to spend a lot of other resources in order to get the orange. Inverse reinforcement learning, this is really only the first stage of how we should think about this theory of mind. And subsequent stages are really beautifully described by, or beautifully shown in this game called the P-beauty game, which actually comes originally from work from John Maynard Keynes, from a suggestion from Maynard Keynes. It has been very nicely investigated by, for instance, Rosemary Nagel in Spain. So here's the rules of the game. Unfortunately, I can't see you, otherwise I would get you to do this and raise your hands. So in this game, each of you in this call would have to choose a number between 1 and 100. And the rules are that I'm going to give a prize to the person whose number is closest to 2/3 of the mean. So I take all the numbers, calculate the mean, and then give a prize to the person who's closest to 2/3 of the mean. So if you just take a minute now to think about what number you would choose in this case. I won't ask you to report it because that would be a bit difficult. Okay, so if you look at the statistics of this in large populations, so this is a population of in the Financial Times, for the Financial Times. So these are Anglo-American business people, largely speaking. What you see, the distributions of the numbers that people report is shown as here. So there are a few people kind of a bit weird out of 100, understand those. And then there's a discrete peaks at 33, 22, in this case also around, around 1 or 2, something like that. So if you think about what could generate this discrete peak, one possible notion is that people thought, okay, well, if everybody just chooses randomly, then the mean will be 50. And so if I want to win, I should choose 2/3 of 50, and then I'll win the prize. So that's what leads you to generate 33. But that's a bizarre way to think if you think about it, because if everybody thought the same way, instead of choosing random numbers between 0 and 100, whose mean would be 50, everybody would choose 33. Then, therefore, if you wanted to win, then you'd want to use 2/3 of that mean, which would again lead you to 22. So what it looks like is that there are people who are thinking discrete stages. And you can see that by these discrete peaks in this distribution. So here's somebody who thought essentially one stage, so we'll call this one level of theory of mind, thinking that everybody else is random, but I'm therefore going to be smarter. This person thought, well, I'm going to be one step smarter than everybody else. Everybody else will choose 33 because they're only one level theory of mind. I'm a 2-level theory of mind person, so I'm going to choose 22. And you can derive other peaks as you go down. So the Nash equilibrium of this game, which means if you said, what should you do? How would you behave in a way that you would have no incentive to change if everybody else behaved in the same way, would be to use the smallest number. I guess here they actually allow them to choose 0, because then nobody can go below that, and that would be stable. But that number actually doesn't win. So here you can see that the average in this population for the Financial Times was about 19, and so the winning number was about 13. So there you have to take account of your hapless fellow human beings. It's not only the Financial Times. Here's another example. This is a German newspaper, very similar, discrete peaks at 33 and 22, and the winning number here was 14.7. And then here's another from a Spanish magazine, and again you see exactly the same thing. So one way of thinking about this is that we have what you might think of as recursive theory of mind, where people are thinking at different levels, and this is a really important construct that we are going to have to worry about. In particular, we're going to worry about this in the context that I don't know that our players don't know everything about the other players. So in an RL reinforcement learning context, there would be a form of partially observable, like MDP, so a POMDP in that context. But here, because we're dealing with other entities that have their own beliefs and their own calculations, just like we saw in the P-Beauty game, this case. Okay, so what would the seller do who's observing this? So now we have our theory of mind, the zero seller who observes this and does some inverse reinforcement learning. So what he does is now to set the price, right? So his job is to look at what the buyer does. He observes that buyer thing and then gets to choose the price. And that price is set in a closed loop way. He does it after he sees that the buyer chooses the apple or chooses the orange in this case. And what you see is if the subject chooses the apple, there's a function, the distance to the apple. This is the price that he's going to set for the apple as a function of that distance. So what you see is, just as we articulated, that if the distance to the apple is very big, that means that the apple is very, very far away, but he still chose the apple. So we're at this corner here, so which is up here. Then the seller sets a very large price for the apple. Doesn't set it to be 10, because of course he still needs the subject to choose the apple in that case, because it looks like that. And then concomitantly, because the sum of the price of the apple and the price of the orange has to be 10, then you can see that then if he sets the price of the apple be high, the price of the orange be low. And what you also notice is if the distance to the apple is 0, so it's very close to the apple here, that and the subject still chooses the apple, then he sets the price to be 50-50. And so that says that, in fact, there's not much information gets leaked by this subject if he chooses the apple when the apple is very close, because he didn't have to go very far to get the apple. So almost any of these different potential values of the apple would be consistent with him choosing the apple if he starts out with the apple very close, except for because he chose the apple. Otherwise, he would choose the orange. Okay, so that's so then when that happens, of course, the consequence is that if the naive buyer really likes the apple, then he's now leaked a lot of information about that to the seller, and then the seller has taken advantage of it. So now we have to have a smarter buyer, and his job is going to be to try and mitigate the chance that the seller will cause these problems for him by changing his behavior. So if this is what he's thinking, he says, if this is what the seller would do, depending on what I choose and how far away I am. The seller knows how far he started. So now the next level up buyer does the following. So you have this slightly more complicated domain of what his choice is. And in particular, what you can see is if he starts very close to the apple, then he has a high probability of choosing the apple, even if he doesn't like the apple very much. Right. So here he still chooses the apple even when the apple is like 1 or 2 units away. Even if he really doesn't like the apple, he much prefers the orange, and that's because, as we saw, that he can then he's therefore not teaching the seller that he really likes the orange in that case, because the seller is just going to set a price of 50-50, the case that this distance to the apple. And then in the middle, there's some interesting complexities of what life looks like very, very close to the middle. And then at the other end, this whole system has to be symmetric between apples and oranges. So now we now look at the probability of choosing the apple. We can compare what happens when the buyer has a low-level theory of mind, just this randomized theory of mind, so level -1, versus this higher-level theory of mind, level 1. And you can see that now this whole curve looks like it's been shifted. Basically, there's it's actually not even a sigmoid. As you can see right in the middle, it's going to be more complicated. But basically what happens is that now his probability of choosing the apple, he's very reluctant to choose the apple. Even if he really likes the apple, he's very reluctant to choose it if he has to go a very long way to get it. There's 7.5 units to get the apple. Whereas, of course, if he starts out very close to the apple, so now he's only like 1 unit away, then he's very likely to choose the apple no matter what. If he is this high-level reasoner, so the level 1 reasoner, he's more likely to choose the apple in that case. So what does the seller do? So the seller now sees what the buyer does, and if the seller is now a higher level seller, the seller is also going to think, well, okay, I know that this is what the buyer is going to do to me, so I have to now be smarter in the way that I set the price. So here we have this whole process which looks like this. Now the way the seller sets the price is now different. So you can see that the region on which it sets the price to be 50-50 has now been elongated. So instead of just being only right at the case that the distance the apple was 0, now because if the apple was this far away, the buyer is going to choose the apple no matter how much he likes the apple. That means that the seller can't change the seller's price over that period. It doesn't know whether the buyer really likes the apple or really likes the orange. And so now this whole envelope of choices gets regularized essentially because of this characteristic. And the same is true at the margins where the distance to the apple is very long. So you can see that this has changed the pricing policy of the seller because the seller realizes that he doesn't have much information about that. And then the next level up, we now have the coordinate hacker. There's not much more that the buyer can do at the next level. So now you see, here's what the policy looks like. It's pretty much like, apart from some complexities in the middle, you can see that this policy has the same characteristics of the policy at level of mind. Depth of mentalization 1 and 3 are very similar in this case. And that's often the case. You get something which looks a bit like convergence. I should say, though, that in general, you do not get convergence to the Nash equilibrium, because this process of these discrete levels, so level 0 is best responding to level -1, level 1 is best responding to 0, and so forth. That process cannot generate a mixed policy, a policy in which you are forced to be stochastic. Whereas we know that in many games, you require these mixed policies. Also, that same is true also in these Bayesian games that we talked about here from Hassani. And so since you can't generate mixed policies, we know that you can't in general get to the Nash equilibrium in this context. Okay, so as an intermediate summary, you can see that here was the whole pattern. The naive buyer, the slightly smarter buyer, the even smarter buyer, shown by these level -1, 1, and 3, the somewhat smart seller, so the seller who's observing the buyer and therefore is one level above the buyer, and the smarter seller like this. And so here you can see that then the benefit of this behavior we see. So theory of mind and pure reward maximization, right? So here they're both parties here are trying to maximize their reward in this context. And it's a mixture. There's an element of a zero-sum game for the buyer and seller, but the buyer also has this additional choice at the beginning. And what it does is give rise to the agents which are being observed, partially hiding their preferences. And a lovely example of this is work by Nicky Clayton on games, which are sort of very extremely smart. These birds are caching, so they give them some food. They will give an opportunity to cache a story in little different pieces of story that can go well, like sauce or something in. What she said is that if they know they're observed by another bird, and these birds will try and hide their caching. So if they're trying to find the caching, if they got this chance, they will actually even recache. They'll say, okay, if I had been observed, then I'm going to have to move where I put the food. If I put the food in one well, I'm going to move it into another of these experimental wells so that I can't be taken advantage of. And the only birds who do this are birds that themselves have been thieves in the past. So, it sort of takes a thief to know a thief, basically, in this instance. So birds that have stolen, they are themselves then more cautious about the way that they express their preferences when they know that they are being observed in this context. So then and then now the observing agents, when you incorporate this theory of mind, they selectively ignore or reinterpret the signals that are sent by the observed agents. So they know that they may be being fooled by the observed agent, and so they're a bit more cautious in this case. Because we're running a partially like a POMDP, we have belief updating, but it's not of course properly Bayesian in the sense because it's operating at a different level then of course that belief updating may not be verifical, may not be quite true. So you see here is mutual information between the actual preference of the and the does. Yeah. So it's expressing this is the information about his preferences this distance. And so I've shown you this for 3 levels of buyer, -1, 1, and 3. So you can see that for level -1, the buyer is giving out information, and it sort of maximizes the information it gives out right at the, as you might imagine, at the times at the 0.5. But it gives out information throughout. And as you get to be a smarter buyer, now, for instance, you give out no information as for this in that period where no matter how much you prefer the apple, you're going to choose the apple no matter what, given that the apple is close. And so there, your action gives no information about the reward value, the value that you give to the apple. And so that's why this information here is 0. We can then see now the skepticism of the seller by asking how much is the KL, by the Kullback-Leibler divergence, how much is the posterior and the prior, how divergent are the posterior and the prior. Remember the agent had a prior, the seller had a prior that the buyer was uniform, so didn't know what the preference was between 0 and 10. And so you can see that the seller, there's a level 0 seller, then you're thinking about the level -1 buyer, then you get a substantial KL divergence. That's the reflection of the information the buyer is leaking to the seller. But in the case that the seller is level 2, is interacting with a level 1 buyer, then you can see that now the prior has, because the buyer is leaking no information here, the seller's posterior is not moved away from its prior in the first place here either. And then you can also look at the error of the seller. So how much has the buyer been able to force the seller to err by, again, looking at another KL divergence between the seller's distribution and the buyer's distribution, of this higher level. And you can see that KL divergence is quite high for when you have a buyer level 1 playing with a seller level 0, but it's actually much lower now where you have a buyer level 3 playing with a seller level 2. So again, this whole process, the elbow room that you have for manipulation has gotten smaller and smaller as both agents have gotten smarter and smarter. And that's actually a very normal characteristic in theory of mind. Okay, so now I want to talk about a slightly more realistic case, which people have done quite extensively in the literature, which is the ultimatum game. So this is another favored microeconomic game. So in the ultimatum game, you have 2 players. One player gets an endowment. In our case, I think the endowment is I think 10 euros. But here, this is where they've now done it over many, many different countries. And here the endowment was notionally 100 points. And so player 1 is the sender, player 2 is the receiver. The sender gets an endowment from the experimenter of 100, let's say 100 units, gets to choose a split with the seller. So let's say the sender says, I'm going to keep 99 units to myself and give 1 unit to you. And then the receiver gets to say yes or no. If the receiver says no, it means that there's no there's no interaction. Neither the sender nor the receiver get anything in the end. If the receiver says yes, then the sender gets whatever the sender suggested, 99 in that case, and the receiver gets 1. So from a pure economic point of view, if points mean money, then of course it's in the receiver's interest to accept anything bigger than 0. So you might think the sender will say 99, the receiver will then say, sure, that's fine, I'll take 1. But in practice, that's not what people do. And so here, this was a cross-cultural study, so it's been done in many countries. Unfortunately, it hasn't been done, it doesn't report the results in Iran, so I'm not sure what will happen in your country. But you can see that across different countries, the mean offer, so people don't choose to keep 99 for themselves and give 1 to the partner. They tend to, in most cases, they give less than 50, which makes sense. You can try and keep more than 50 yourself. Not always. There's, I think, one place where it's more than 50. I hear about Paraguay. And then the rejection happens at a threshold as well. So people don't like being taken advantage of in these games, and so therefore they reject too. So this is an interesting game, interesting construct game, because we can then see how it is that you should play according to different sorts of players. So here we're going to imagine an ultimatum game that we're playing 12 rounds in a row, where the sender is always the same sender, and the receiver is always the receiver. But now we have a couple of different sorts of sender and receiver. So one sort of sender is just random, just chooses a random number between 0 and 100, or between 0 and 10, I think, in our game. And so for that sender, there's no reason for the receiver ever to reject, right? Because the sender is just a random number. So I imagine there's nothing I can nothing the receiver can do to improve its lot. Then we also have threshold senders, who are senders whose return is reduced by a threshold. So here, a threshold sender reduced by 0.1 means that that sender has to get more than 0.1 of the endowment, so more than 10% of the endowment, to have any positive utility. A threshold sender whose threshold is 0.5, then they have to get 50% of the utility to have even to be positive. And then we have these agents who are, again, we think about level of different levels of mentalization. So here's this notion of the utility as a function of the threshold. So if you have so for the sender, it's 1 minus whatever it gives away. So it makes a suggestion to the receiver, minus its threshold. And then for the receiver, we also have these threshold receivers where the threshold could be 0, which means the receiver is happy to take anything, but of course would like to have as much as possible. So this is just a threshold. The utility becomes negative if you're below the threshold, but it doesn't become. So you'd never take those. But it's still, you'd like to get as much money as you, as many points as you can above the threshold. Okay, so what policy can we imagine? Again, the whole thing gets grounded at this -1 level, where we start. So what does the -1 sender do? Right, the -1 sender, if it's random, just acts randomly, and then we imagine a very simple policy for the threshold senders, so these senders who like to get have these thresholds, where what they do is what you might imagine, which is essentially a myopic use of lower and upper bounds. So they maintain lower and upper bounds of how much they need to send, and whenever the receiver rejects, they increase the amount. They're going to have to increase the lower bound of what they offer. Whenever the agent accepts, they can decrease the upper bound of what they have to send in order to make the receiver happy. And then in between, they just choose randomly with respect to their own utility functions. They have a softmax utility with respect to that. So we have some bounds, and they say there's no point in my sending less than I think I'm going to get rejected for, and there's no point in my sending more than I think that I can get away with. And then in between that, I just use my own utility function with respect to those bounds. So now what we'll see is the right behavior, the correct behavior for a sender, for a higher level sender, is to pretend to be random. And the reason for that is that the rational receiver, if the rational receiver thinks that the sender is random, then the receiver has no reason to reject, right? You're just getting money from a lottery for free. You should go and take it. You can't influence the sender if you think the sender is random. So how does that look in this game? So here we're having a -1 sender against a level 0 receiver. And so here we're seeing the 3 senders. And when it's solid, it means that the receiver accepted it. When it's open, it means the receiver rejected it. So you can see that the random sender just happily chooses these random numbers, and you can see that the receiver, in this instance, accepts, might as well. The receiver's being offered a huge amount of money here, if you like. Whereas for the threshold senders, they have these upper and lower bounds, and of course they have utility between them. So what the threshold senders do is to offer very low amounts of money to start with, and then they just get dragged upwards by these upper and lower bounds that I mentioned. And you can see that the threshold sender who's willing to take less, which is this 0.1 threshold sender, in the end ends up by offering more, being forced to offer more to the receiver because of the way the receiver rejects. So now we can see what the receiver is able to conclude about the sender. And here the receiver is smarter than the sender. It's level 0, whereas the sender is level -1. And you can see that over trials, the receiver is capable of inferring exactly what sort of sender it has. So if it's a random sender, then it thinks it's random. If it's a threshold sender like this, it thinks it's threshold. So the receiver has figured out what the sender is, and that's why he can exploit the sender and therefore get this maximum amount of money that he can from the sender. What happens when we move now to a smarter sender? So now this is a level 1 sender playing with a level 0 receiver. And now we see something quite different happening. So again, the random case is just a random case, just a different random sample of that. But now when you have the threshold sender, what they do at the beginning is offer a substantial an offer. So compare that to the offer that the senders do here. They offer 0.1. Here, the senders offer substantially more, 0.3 or 0.5. And so what's happening is the sender, the smart sender, is thinking, I need to convince the receiver that I'm random. If I can convince them they're random, then I can exploit the receiver forevermore because of, well, for as long as he thinks that I'm random. Because there's no point in rejecting any of these random offers. And so what happens is he offers a, for instance, this one here, the 0.1 sender, offers a substantial sum, convinces the receiver that he's random, and then it completely exploits the receiver thereafter. And if you can see that exploitation very clearly in the inference that the receiver makes about the sender, where in all these three cases, the receiver has inferred that the sender is actually random, although in fact the sender is not random. And here you can see that's even the case in the 0.5 case, where the sender still offered more than he did before, but offers only 0.3, and the receiver actually rejected that, but it still becomes convinced that that sender can't be anything other than a random sender, because it thinks that non-random senders start off by offering much lower sums of money themselves. And so now you can see that the exploitation has worked, which means that the average reward per trial that the sender actually gets, that the receiver actually gets, is much lower than it otherwise would be, and particularly lower for the case the sender is a 0.5, is this sender here. And so the receiver has been completely taken advantage of in this case, which is obviously very unfortunate for the receiver in this case. Now there's a flip side of this, which is now you have this notion of which Joe Bombay and Nitai like to call a sort of paranoia. So now, if you're a smart, you're an even smarter sender. So now we have this theory of mind 2, theory of mind 2 receiver playing with what is actually a very dumb sender. So here the sender is level -1. The theory of mind 2 receiver is thinking, well, I know that if I see some behavior which looks like it's random, that is probably just the sender trying to pretend to be random to take advantage of me. So now we have this very smart receiver, which is being over smart. If the sender really is a dumb sender, a dumb random sender in this case, then the receiver is going to be over cautious and thereby not exploit what he could exploit in this sender being this random sender. So true randomness is very hard to infer, right? It's very hard to infer what that randomness is, and so that's going to be a cost for the receiver to look this way. So and so what you can see happening here is that the beliefs of the receiver are in the case that we have the sender, which is actually is being, so here we have the sender is a 0.1 or a 0.5 sender. So here the receiver is being is correctly worrying about what that sender is like, but it means that during that time, if the sender really is random, then the receiver is not going to be able to take advantage of that. So there's a sort of paranoia effect which happens where the sender is actually harming, where the receiver is harming themselves because they're not exploiting the sender as much as they could do. And so here you can see the reward ratio for the sender as a function of the sender's theory of mind, and this is the receiver's theory of mind. So you see the sender actually does better here when the receiver is level 2 than when the receiver is level 2 than when the receiver is level 0, because essentially the receiver is being a bit fooled here. The receiver is being overcautious in this sort of form of paranoia. Okay, so this is the case where being smart. One case where being smart is dangerous. Now, there's another flip side of that, which is you can think, well, how can I try to protect myself against a smarter sender? So now we know that if I'm a level 0, I can only think that the thing I'm playing with is a level -1. I can't conceive of what a level 1 theory of mind is like, because I'm just not able to think about that. That's sort of part of the definition of this theory of mind. Just like in the P-Beauty game, we saw these discrete peaks. The guy doing 33 just can't think that there would be other people would do 33, and therefore he should do 22 instead. So what we need is to have some, is there some information that the level of the theory of mind 0 can use, so here the receiver can use to protect themselves against a smarter sender who's going to pretend to be random. So here's the toss dynamics in this case, another case where the sender offers more money at the beginning and fools the agent, fools the receiver into thinking they're random, although in the end that does break down a bit at the end. So one thing that we do have to take advantage of is that the receiver does have a model of what he expects the sender to be, right? So here, the receiver, in this instance, believes that the sender should be random. That's what he's actually inferring this way. But if it was really random, then there's some information that he can expect to get that he could try and exploit to try and say, that is this behavior that I'm seeing really random? He can't use likelihood because he doesn't have the correct model class essentially in mind. So you can't look at comparative likelihood. You don't know what to rate that against. But what the receiver could do is to look at, for instance, how much return am I getting? Am I getting what I expected from a random sender? Or they could also look at some notion of typicality. So this is a notion from large deviation theory. Like, how typical is this set of information of offers I'm getting? So for instance, here, it was really random. You'll be very surprised if the sender was really choosing randomly, that you keep on getting these very low offers. Now, of course, any individual offer, if it really was a random sender, is just as likely as any other individual offer. But if you saw all these offers which are low, they are not typical for random behavior. Similarly, the average reward you're getting is also not typical given that. So here, we can imagine that that the receiver is monitoring the average return, also monitoring this degree of typicality, this information theoretic notion of typicality, and then can essentially just say that can estimate statistically that it's being taken advantage of. Now, in this instance, there's nothing that the receiver can do. Can't think beyond what the sender is like, because he can't envision a sender like that. But what he can do is just threaten to essentially throw his toys out of the pram. He can threaten to cut the interaction completely, which means that I essentially offer nothing to the always reject completely, and therefore the threat of doing that is going to have to keep the sender in line. So in some sense, the receiver has to make a credible threat to the sender, so the sender is therefore unwilling to risk this behavior of the receiver. So it's a bit like the way that actually anger works. So when you're really angry, you're saying, telegraphing, you're willing to do something that's actually harmful to yourself. That's you see this here as the credible that the agent can make. Because the accuracy, the idea of the accuracy, where you can't think what the agent does, to keep the other agent in line, what you do is you threaten something really awful for both you and the other agent in order.
Sorry, Professor. I think something happened. I think you have to open the microphone. The microphone is off. Sorry, we can't hear you. I think the microphone could be.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear
Good.
your web
Let me
chat.
just share my screen again. Sorry
Okay.
about that.
No, we have your screen too.
Yeah. Let me just go back to this.
Okay, so sorry about the problem.
That's okay. Not your fault, I'm sure. Who knows why these things never go so smoothly. I'm almost done anyway. Okay, so you have to make a credible threat. And so then you're to throw your trust out of the pram. And if you can do that, then it's in the interest of the sender not to allow you to make not to tempt you into this problem in the first place. So merely by threatening to stop the interaction, if the sender knows that, then the sender is going to have to behave, even though you're unable to model the sender in detail. But the sender can see that you can think through the fact that you're going to be modeling what the sender is doing itself. What this shows is that the cumulative reward ratio, if you have just treat it like this, a regular IPOM-DP, then the sender does a lot better than the receiver, gets 3 times more reward than the receiver. If we have this Aleph IPOM-DP where we allow for this credible threat mechanism, now the sender's ability to exploit the receiver is dramatically reduced. So now you get a much less degree of exploitation from that. Okay, so let me just summarize. So what we've done here is we've gone from inverse reinforcement learning, which is what you do for theory of mind 0 playing with theory of mind -1, to deception. We saw that where you pretend to be random, for instance. Protection, where you have this idea that you're trying to protect yourself, like the buyer doesn't chooses the apple if the apple is close, no matter how much he likes the orange. And threats, whereby you have to have this credible threat mechanism. We have dynamic belief updating, it's a POM-DP, at the heart of this is a POM-DP, but we have non-stationarity. So the inferences you're doing are not sort of sound inferences if the world is stationary. So normally for a POM-DP, you imagine that you're operating in a stationary world. But here, because of the interactivity, you actually operate in a world which will look to be non-stationary. And if you're have the wrong decision level, then it actually will be non-stationary in a way that you can't even project. And then these mixed motive games are the most interesting sorts of games to look at for this, because they're the ones where you want to take some advantage by cooperating, like in the ultimatum game, right? In the end, the receiver wants to get some money and can only get money if the sender is willing to send it, but the sender can only get money if the receiver is willing to accept. And so mixed motive games are the richest and most interesting interactions in these cases. We see this impact of the depth of mentalization. So how many levels up you go, starting from -1, where you have this completely naive agent, all the way up, in principle to infinity. But as we saw, you tend not to get really interesting new behavior at different levels of reasoning. There's obviously a very critical dependence on the level -1 strategy. So the strategy you adopt that -1, and if that's different or wrong, then of course then the interaction can break down in particular ways. We saw the difficulty of being too smart. That's to say this paranoid case where you had a theory of mind 2 receiver who just refused to believe the evidence of their eyes that the sender was random, and therefore didn't exploit the sender as much as they might have done as well. More levels down than you, although again, they're thinking all the way there because you're being too smart for your own good. It's not paranoia, it's just that there you're not thinking that the population will be richer than the population that you thought itself. And we can mitigate that a little bit by trying to detect this manipulation. But you can't do that with likelihood because, as I said, you don't have the right model class to be thinking about. And indeed, if you're thinking about randomness, we know that any individual set of choices is just as likely as any other individual set of choices. So you can't use likelihood to rule out the fact that the agent that the agent you're playing with is random or is not being random. Instead, you have to use other statistics. And so we talked about the average or this strong typicality notion itself. And so then for that, we need to have this Aleph policy, which then is detecting this deception itself. And indeed, we first used an Aleph-like policy in the context of personality disorders. So part of my lab works on computational psychiatry. So we're very interested in disorders of interaction, amongst the other things, interaction between individuals. So in personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, people act in a way that when they're threatened, they act in an extremely unpleasant way. And what we argue in a version a bit like the ultimatum game, there's a sort of mechanism by which parties can be irritated if they're irritable, and then when they're irritated, they don't cooperate. And so for normal people, because I know that you might be irritated when I interact with you, that will change the way I interact with you. And so think again like the anger strategy I talked about, this sort of the throwing the toys out of the pram. So if I don't know that you have that characteristic, then I will blunder on no matter what, and that can then lead to a breakdown of interaction, which can be unfortunate for all the parties. So lots of rich stuff to do in theory of mind. Thank you very much. And that's just solving the POMDP itself. So formally, we can just go up one level after the other. So of course, what we're thinking about things like amortization. So you can say, can I, if I can learn what the policy, what the value structure is like, so value iteration, and you can do obviously many different ways of solving POMDP. So we've often used POMCP, so this partial observable, which is a stochastic, a bit like MCTS, but designed for POMDPs from David Silver group. So we tend to use that, because it's a more efficient way of solving these cases. But certainly you have to worry about these different levels. So in the games I talked about, we're just about at the limits of how far we can go, and you do things like discretize belief spaces and so forth. So you have to do quite a lot of computational tricks. But I think it's worth doing them because it really tells you something about the structure of the control you get in those cases. So that's I think that's how we've done it. So you can use any value-based, use any of the usual tricks for solving POMDPs, but you have to solve them in this hierarchy, which makes it complicated.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Also, I was wondering if there's a study on the population that shows what's the distribution of the level of theory of minds that people has, and is there such a study?
Yeah, so Colin Camera has done a study. So he has a slightly different notion of theory of mind, or slightly different way of thinking about their levels, but quite related. So what he has is what's called a Poisson cognitive hierarchy, where what you do is you think that you have a level, let's say you're level 4, then you think that everybody else comes from a Poisson distribution with a certain mean, except it's truncated at level 3, right? You can't think anybody is as smart as you because you can't think of what that would be like. And you could then ask, in that case, to answer your question, you say, well, what's that mean of that Poisson distribution that tells you how smart your fellow man is? Unfortunately, that number is 1.5. So people are just not very smart. So people don't, in general, like to think too many stages down, and that comes from a range of these games. And you can see in the PBG game, there are quite a lot of people who are going 33 and 22, right? So people are not thinking that hard in these cases. But of course, if it's really valuable to you, if you're playing, if you're playing a board game with your friends, or if you're, then some of this Machiavellian reasoning becomes important. And I think that what we haven't done yet, but what we really like to do, is to understand how can you sort of sprinkle a little bit of theory of mind on what is normally just a regular interaction. So when is it worth your while, really, devoting enough of this computational resource to solving the theory of mind properly that actually you get the maximum value? And that's a meta control problem, essentially. And so like many meta control problems in RL, we're thinking, now how should you do your computation in MCTS? How should you do your computation in POMDP? Now we just ask that question in spades, where you say, how should you use your computation in an IPOMDP in order to optimize your return? That then becomes a really interesting question.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question from the same person. He's asking, I don't know he or she, he or she is asking, is there any convergence between game theoretic approaches and interactive POMDP under certain assumption for interactive POMDP?
Yes, so we are exactly so. These are exactly microeconomic games, right? The ultimatum game is a microeconomic game, and even the buyer-seller game is exactly a game. So there is definitely a convergence in terms of the problem class we're looking at. Now, the normal solution mechanism for these partially observable games is called the Bayes-Nash equilibrium that comes from Harsanyi. Somebody actually won the Nobel Prize 60 years ago or something. He did this work 60 years ago on this, and that's this infinite construct that I mentioned at the end, where like a Nash equilibrium says, I will do this behavior provided everybody else. I have no reason not to do this behavior provided everybody else has no reason not to do the other behavior to do the behavior they do themselves. And we know that in general, this is the one case that you need to have stochastic policy. So in normal POMDPs or MDPs, then you can it's the theorem, it's a very simple theorem that says that there is always an optimum deterministic policy in those cases, right? So in some cases, if you have equal values, you can be stochastic, but you don't have to be. But in game theory, so think of things like rock, paper, scissors, or matching pennies, if you know about it. Then those games, if you are deterministic, then you can be taken advantage of. So you need to have mixed strategies. So rock, paper, scissors, traditionally you should go a third, a third, a third is essentially the Nash equilibrium. But the mechanism that I've talked about, where you have this strict level hierarchy, this sequential hierarchy, that can't generate mixed strategies because you're always playing against what looks like a very complicated but fixed opponent. Essentially, that opponent does all these calculations themselves, thinking that they're smarter than you, but they aren't smarter than you. You're smarter than them, but nevertheless, it's a fixed opponent. So it would have a deterministic optimum strategy. So you can't get to optimum stochastic strategies as mixed strategies that way. So you don't get to Nash equilibria. We have not tried to characterize the class of problems in which the infinite, because of course there are games in which it's optimally deterministic as well. We haven't tried to characterize those or look at the costs that you would have according to that. And I think that's quite an interesting, if complicated, thing to do in some cases.
Thank you, Professor. We have other questions. Asking, in games, higher order beliefs can feel like infinite regress. I know that, you know that, I know that. She's or he's giving an example. Does this challenges the notion of agency or free will?
Okay, that's a big philosophical question. So first of all, we exactly don't have infinite regress here, right? Because we've talked about these finite cases, right? So we have literally theory of mind -1, theory of mind 0. There's no infinite regress there. It only becomes infinite if you really go up to infinity, and we can see in things like the PVD game that actually the answer to that you have this Poisson hierarchy of 1.5. So people don't actually go infinite that way. Now, in terms of agency and free will, then I don't think, and I think those are very interesting, complicated constructs themselves, but there's nothing about what I've talked about which then challenges that notion of agency or free will. You are a free agent. You're making choices yourself, like the buyer and the seller. The buyer is making in my shopping game, is making of its own free will, is choosing whether to get the apple or the orange in the first case, right? And that's true no matter what level of reason it has. It's just that in order to avoid being taken advantage of, it's choosing differently than it otherwise would, because it's thinking about the whole sequence of interactions. So in this case, the 2 interactions that it actually has, but in general, many more interactions themselves. So there's no shortage of free will here. It's just that the ability, the elbow room, if you like, to use a term from Dennett, the elbow room of exploiting your free will has become less, because it's not in your interest, for instance, to go a very long way to get the orange if you think I'm going to be taken advantage of in the future. So just like any other interaction like that, but you're free to do the correct thing in that case. It's just that correct thing is unfortunately a bit limited by the environment.
Okay, thank you, Professor. We have other question. Do cognitive hierarchies imply a link between theory of mind and subjective awareness, or is recursion just a useful computational tool?
Good. So there's a very active, there's a so I hope to be a fairly active link between metacognition and theory of mind. So metacognition is a theory of your own mind, where typically, so you think about how like your confidence in the choices you're making, or like meta controllers I described, that you want to choose how much effort to put into the computations you're doing. So that's a sort of, those are typically thought of as being metacognitive processes. And then on the other hand, you have a theory of other people's minds, which is then the other minds there. So certainly the issue of whether you're actually doing the calculations the way that I described it, right? So I described this level of theory of mind calculations versus, for instance, having a model-free policy which has learned how to exploit the other, another agent in a particular way. We can't tell that behaviorally. Just like all economics is a very behaviorist discipline, where we just see some behavior and then we make some inferences about what would underlie that behavior. So we don't know whether or not subjects are doing, if we see some behavior, we wouldn't know exactly the underlying constructs unless we do things like change the domain and see, well, what happens to the behavior. So the same is true in general in reinforcement learning. We have this idea about model-based and model-free reasoning. So retrospective versus prospective reasoning about what to do. But I think that the nice link is to try and link together this metacognitive sense and the theory of theory of your own mind, theory of other minds. So people like Chris Frith has done some work on this. I had a student, Leon Schultz, one of the people I mentioned, had done quite some work on this in his thesis.
Okay, thank you, Professor. There's other question. How might cognitive hierarchies have evolved? Are there simple environments where even minimal recursion provide a decisive advantage?
Yes. So as soon as you have a mixed motive game, you absolutely, the solution concept is going to be recursion of some sort right now, or a Bayesian equilibrium. And there's a whole bunch of work on evolutionary game theory, right? So you are having games, organisms are playing games with each other in these ways. So I think it's so then the issue is, well, how much cost are you willing to pay? How much of it is the explicit recursion versus versus learning this model-free strategies which do a good job in a game? You could just learn what I should do in a game theoretic context, like learning opening moves in chess. Right? They actually have an appropriate rule. You don't need to have a theory of mind of the opponent for that. So I think that it's very highly plausible that you can evolve these recursive relationships as soon as you live in an environment where there are mixed motives. And hunting has, in fact, one of the classic games that people use in game theory is called the stag hunt game. That's a game where you have two players, and if they go together, they can get a stag. But then you have an incentive to defect and get a rabbit. The rabbit's so close to you, and so that's with less value to you. And so you have a very nice case where people have looked at, in that case, you could well imagine the evolution of a theory of mind, where I don't exactly know whether you're going to go into the rabbit or not, but so then it's your interest to try and fool me in certain circumstances and not. And if we play a repeated game, so we're hunter-gatherer situation where this happens again and again, then for instance, the anger mechanism I talked about, we can see that as coming out of it's one sort of solution concept to the case that you're being taken advantage, your danger of being taken advantage of by higher level organisms, higher level people.
Okay, thank you, Professor. If people have other follow-up questions, just you can raise your hand. I can give you microphone access. Okay, if there is none, there is one other question that asked offline is, what do you think the theory of mind and plays, what role do you think theory of mind plays in the future of AI, in the technologies that will deploy? For example, we can easily imagine that the systems like ChatGPT can have theory of minds, different higher level of theory of minds, and they can impose what they want. The companies that control them impose what they want on the large population. What do you think the future, the role that theory of mind plays in the future of AI, and what are their dangers, or what do you think about?
Yes, so there's actually a lot of work at the moment asking exactly the question, which is how deep a theory of mind does a large language model have, right? And so people have then done a lot of not very sophisticated tests. So the classic tests like the Sally-Ann test, which is a case where you have a little problems where you sort of hide something from somebody and ask whether or not what they will know in other cases. So these are used in autism, for instance, in autism research. And what people show in those cases is that current editions of LLMs typically can pass the versions of those tests which are very similar to the way they're described in the current literature. But they don't pass the test when you think in a higher order way, because the complexity of all this reasoning that I talked about is not very, not very easy for them. And so you can get, DeepSeek could generate some huge reasoning chain for that, but it's not a very effective way of doing those computations. I don't think that that thinking through in English language is the right way to think about these numbers anyway, in some sense that you actually have. But you're absolutely right that then in the future of AI, as soon as you have an AI agent which is interacting with us, then it's in the interest of the agent to build a theory of mind for us. Just like when I interact with you, I have a theory, you're building a theory, I build a theory of your minds, and you build a theory of my mind in order to make the interaction go smoothly, or in the interaction go in the way that you actually want it to yourself. And indeed, if you look at science fiction, like Arthur C. Clarke, a lot of the work that he was doing is actually thinking about how the sort of theory of mind that robots and people have of each other, which can then lead to errors. So I think this is a very important construct, and you're quite right that if these computers can, of course, they can outsmart us. Essentially, they in certain circumstances they can do more of the recursive reasoning more quickly than we can. And the one saving grace in a way is it's impossible to do the recursive reasoning at the like infinite recursive reasoning or very high, because we know that POMDPs are radically computationally complicated for these systems as well. So in the end, they'll be having heuristics, we have heuristics, and how these heuristics will fight with each other will be important. So I think that theory of mind is certainly important once you start to interact with artificial agents that are sufficiently like us that we worry about their theory of mind themselves. So I think that's going to be a really interesting area to look at.
Thank you, Professor. Someone asked another question. How might AI agents develop or defend against deceptive strategies in multi-agent systems?
So it's just they could do exactly what I just described, right? So for instance, to develop yourself, you just build a model of some sort. We know that LLMs are capable of building sort of models. The in-context learning, for instance, is a particular sort of modeling strategy in a way for what the entity they're operating with is like. And then to defend against it, then there the issue is to be alert to the extent that you can be, and that's this issue about the recursive reasoning. What's interesting then is to say, the throw your toys out of the pram strategy is a strategy that we can apply, right? At the moment, these LLMs are obsequiously polite, and so they've yet to start throwing their toys out of the pram when we interact with them. Maybe perhaps Elon Musk's one is the least polite of all of them, for obvious reasons. But I think that the issue about defenses against different levels of reasoning are the defenses I've talked about. And in general, you would like to defend by being smarter, but you also have these potential ways of defending by threatening to cut off interaction. And I think that certainly is an effective way that you can imagine that AI agents will be able to exploit too.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I can see another question. If there is no question from the audience, okay, I can ask the final question that I always ask. For the people that just starting their careers, if you were in their shoes and you were starting right now and you have these curiosities in your mind, how would you navigate your path? What major, what do you go on, major on, what courses do you take, and what path do you choose if you started today in 2025? And
so first thing to do is to say that try not to be too sucked in to the technology of the minute, basically. So obviously LLMs, you look at the AI conferences, they're just completely dominated by LLMs. Of course, there's a completely fascinating devices. There are many things that they do. But if you start to say, I'm going to become an expert in that, and then by the time you get to you're actually making research contributions yourself, it's too late. You're trying to compete against something which is non-competable. So I think that you need to get the absolute, for yourselves as students, you should get the absolute bases correct. Understand there's probabilistic reasoning, understand that this is you're doing, understand the reinforcement learning and so forth that you do. So don't only rely on deep learning to solve all your problems, right? That's it's very tempting to say, okay, I just throw don't have to think any longer. All I need to is get a lot of data, throw it into a deep neural network, and all my problems will be solved. That's not going to solve all the problems in the future either. And I think that for me, for my career, this interface between thinking about scientific problems and thinking about engineering problems, that's a really excellent interface to be thinking about. So we're not only thinking about engineering problems. I spend most of my time, I'm really a computational neuroscientist, I barely think about engineering problems at all. But I think that interface, that's where a lot of stuff really gets to be really to be both extremely interesting area. There are really big sources of data. Biology is a fantastic source of solutions, and then understanding how to exploit that and how to copy those, I think is going to be really important.
Thank you, Professor. Okay.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation. Really nice to see you.
Thank you for being with us. It was really an honor, and I'm so excited about it, even at the end. Okay. Thank you, and okay, have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much indeed, and sorry for the interruption. Bye.